much, everyone. I'm really delighted today to welcome Boston Globe business writer Jon Chesto to the Wilson Forum. Much of our attention over the past 2 years has been focused on the electric grid and climate or environmental issues, and these are subjects that Jon writes on regularly in his column in the Globe. And I'll read them. And Jon, I'm just delighted that you're with us because you clearly have your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the Commonwealth in terms of issues related to the energy generation and distribution and the grid and environmental issues. And that's what really where we focus much of our attention. So we're just really delighted to have you with us. We're going to have a session today that's sort of a conversation among people who have similar interest. And Jon, I'm gonna turn the floor over to you to begin the conversation. I hope that things of for example, offshore wind and the energy demand, which is skyrocketing at the moment, and perhaps the fate of the New England electric grid will come up in the conversation. But I leave it to you to talk about subjects that you think are emerging and important, and from the point of view, your perspective as a writer for a major newspaper, what things we should be hearing about. So, Jon, welcome to the Wilson Forum. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Ron. I'm sort of humbled by the brain power in the virtual room here. I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to add to the conversation, but what I will do is give you a little bit of I've been covering business and government and the intersection of business and government in New England since the beginning of electric deregulation. And so I've sort of followed the various chapters of that and how it's unfolded. And maybe I'll go through a few of those chapters and then give you an idea of sort of the energy issues I'm looking at now and trying to follow. And so maybe we can have a conversation about that. And maybe there's things I should know about that I'm not following. As you can probably guess, I'm following what the Healy administration and regulators and their counterparts in other New England states are doing, as well as what the Massachusetts legislature and to a lesser extent, what the legislatures in other New England states are doing in terms of climate and energy policy. And they're obviously climate and energy policy now are intermingled, or they're completely linked. But I just want to say, when this all so. I'll call it deregulation. Purists would call what happened in the late 90s electricity restructuring, because obviously utilities are still highly regulated in terms of the transmission and delivery of electricity to homes. But the generation industry was deregulated, and this has created all sorts of change for good and to some bad since that time. And I was just a young reporter and I didn't quite grasp what was about to happen. To be honest, I thought, means people are going to be shopping around for their electricity. I didn't realize how hard it would be to shop around for electricity. And that is a storyline that is actually now coming to the fore here in Massachusetts because of legislation that could very well come to fruition to block competitive suppliers from selling electricity to consumers. So early on, what deregulation did was it sort of removed the generation from utilities. And this, in the end, was a good thing because, and again, I was too young to be there for this, but the way I look at it is if you're a utility, and you want to build something, you pretty much can get it in the rate base. And yeah, there's some haggling and back and forth, but the problem is it makes for a bit of a monopoly and probably not the best decision making. I mean, I think that if that system was in place today, a lot of these generation facilities would get a lot more scrutiny than they did when they were first built. But as a result, there was a big push to sort of run the coal plants out of town. And so there was a lot of money put into natural gas plants. And it's interesting that the environmentalists who are fighting natural gas now were very interested in bringing natural gas to New England as a I mean, there was some of it here, but really the rise of the quote merchant generators brought a lot of natural gas to New England about 25 years ago. And as a result, we're now highly dependent on natural gas, which does, by most measures, is much cleaner for the environment than burning coal and oil. And that reliance on natural gas has really been sort of the blessing and the curse of New England electricity since that time. And then as we moved on through the late aughts, there was a move to pursue state green policies, including increasing the amount of renewable electricity that the utilities need to purchase. Also, solar friendly policies, including net metering, and more recently, really a push to get to net zero, which means sort of carbon neutral by 2050, which means really taking the carbon out of the electric grid, among other aspects of the economy. And so we saw a few efforts to bring large gas pipelines in, because the pipeline system into New England is very constrained. And of course, we have a lot of excess natural gas thanks to fracking in the Marcellus Shale, which helped mitigate electric price increases that we all of a sudden had this large domestic supply of natural gas. But the critics would say we shouldn't be building a large infrastructure for natural gas when we're eventually trying to wean ourselves off of that. So that still happens today. Even though we didn't get the two big pipelines that we wanted, or say that the utility industry wanted, we have smaller battles happening about increasing capacity on the grid that exists, the gas grid, that will continue no matter, if you're trying to build a compressor station, for example, you're guaranteed to have to fight it out. And so that's the kind of like, what do we do? Do we just go full force into electric, or do we kind of hold on to natural gas? And how does that balance work is a major, I would say, struggle for state policymakers right now. The other thing, so we've seen the rise of, as we've moved toward renewable sources, the goal, there were some little bit of efforts to create long-term contracts for wind, but they were not huge. I think wind, they were not like material to the grid. And I think onshore wind just found itself against that same sort of opposition that the gas lines ran into. No one wanted to be near a wind farm. And so the general shift was, let's move offshore. The technology reached the point that we didn't need to build, Cape Wind, if you're familiar, was an idea to build smaller turbines, smaller relatively to what we are building in Nantucket Sound on a shallow area called Horseshoe Shoals. Now, which would be visible from a lot of, Cape Cod and the islands. Now the effort is to build these wind turbines. So we have one project, I believe it just completed, that's off of that is feeding electricity to Long Island, called South Fork, and then we have another one that's still underway called Vineyard Wind. And these are projects like south of the islands or west of the islands, southwest of the islands. So they're less visible from shore. If you can still see off into the distance, but they're not as intrusive, and you still have clashes with the fishermen, and there are certainly other issues that come with building these, such as where do you bring the lines on shore? Oftentimes the cheapest way to do it is through existing beaches, and you can understand why that would get controversial. And that's created all sorts of controversies. The big hiccup in this offshore wind development was all these contracts. We got Vineyard Wind, we got the two I just named, but then all these other, we had all over the Northeast, many of the states had these contracts to build significant wind farms and locked in at certain prices. But then after, it was a combination of the Ukraine war, which drove up metal costs, and the meteoric rise of interest rates, driven in large part by the Federal Reserve to tamp down inflation, made borrowing, made developing these wind farms too expensive, and they couldn't meet the terms of the contract. So everywhere, pretty much, the contracts were essentially ripped up. Some of them did have to pay some sort of fee for walking away. And now we're in the midst of an effort to sort of bring back those wind farms at a higher price. New York just finished theirs. Interesting that that Massachusetts is now working with Connecticut and Rhode Island, and their bidding process will wrap up next week. And there'll be some bidders, and the prices will be higher. And the question is, how much higher? How much political appetite is there for paying a lot extra for offshore wind? In terms of the purported benefit of helping to mitigate climate change. If we had not kind of worked together at the three, I talked to one offshore wind developer that's bidding in. She was a prominent person on that team, and she said that if it wasn't for the three states getting together, they probably would not be bidding in again. So it was a smart move, and probably prompted by the developers, that the three states got together on this. And so they're no longer going to be competing for, you get these jobs, you get these jobs. They're going to cooperate to figure out where the best places to land these, the best places to develop them on shore. And I think that's a better approach, because we're all really in the same grid, and it's in everyone's best interest to support the grid. So now, back up to what I was saying about the coal plants. Pretty much all went away. There's one still sort of hanging on in New Hampshire. I believe it hasn't closed yet, but it's barely there. The gas plants are gradually going. The nuclear, we've lost much of our nuclear capacity. We still have two nuclear generators that are providing an important baseline of power. And so we need that offshore wind. We do have a lot of solar, and a lot of the solar is behind the meter, and that has helped mitigate the growth. But the demand, or helps address the demand. But the issue, I don't need to tell anyone here this, but, as we're looking to remove carbon from various, heating and transportation, that means that the theory is we have to go electric, and that will put huge demands on the grid. And so getting offshore wind as sort of a large power plant level amount of megawatts of generation is going to be crucial to be able to keep up with that demand. So how the next few years of how these contracts play out with the states is going to be really important. So obviously I'm watching those contracts. I'm watching the fights over what we still need to do in terms of keeping natural gas in the system. One example, and it'll be interesting to see if there are protests about it. With the retirement of the Mystic power plant, which is almost completely gone now, the LNG terminal that brings natural gas into New England is tied to that. That power plant is its largest customer, and once Mystic went, that LNG terminal was probably going to close too. So the gas companies have worked together, and in Massachusetts, National Grid and Eversource are both the largest electric and the largest gas companies. The gas companies have worked together to create a long-term contract system to keep the LNG terminal in place, but it's very unusual. We haven't seen something like that before. So that needs to be approved by the Mass DEPU. And what kind of fights there will be about that. In Massachusetts, like I said, the offshore wind contracts will be, quote, opened up next week. Right now, the leaders of the Massachusetts legislature are maneuvering for another climate bill. One thing that'll be really interesting, Connecticut approved a contract to help support the Millstone power plant. And the argument in Connecticut was not just electricity, but these are jobs and taxes. Now that Massachusetts doesn't really see those jobs and taxes, but we may leave the door open to have long-term contracts for nuclear to help support those plants, keep them from closing. The Dominion is the company, and they've been lobbying hard for that. And so that is a matter of some debate that I'm going to be watching at the legislature. 10 years ago, nuclear was considered sort of an evil villain in the energy world, and I think many people have come to realize the carbon reduction benefits of nuclear. We still haven't figured out where to store the spent fuel rods, but Fukushima really set all that back. The Fukushima incident in Japan, but you're starting to see gradually more support for nuclear again. I would be very surprised to see a new nuclear reactor built in New England, but I think keeping the two that we have is considered paramount. We also have a power line. Speaking of nuclear, NextEra is a major operator of the other nuclear power plant, Seabrook in New Hampshire. And they have been fighting tooth and nail a large power line that Avangrid is trying to develop to bring hydroelectricity from Quebec down into Massachusetts, because NextEra does not want to compete with that low cost power from Hydro-Quebec. And originally it was on the QT. They were basically funding grassroots organizations to fight it. But then there was a ballot question, so they had to sort of register the money they were spending, and it was clear they've spent tens of millions of dollars to fight it. In the end, the ballot, in Maine, this is in Maine, where the Clean Energy Connect, New England Clean Energy Connect, would come down the west coast of Maine and plug in, still in Maine, but bring power into the New England grid for Massachusetts. The state's highest court eventually, so the voters said no more, we're going to block it. But then the state's highest court has basically ruled in favor of the state regulators who had approved the power line, and the power line construction is resuming. So that's eventually going to come online. But many of you are probably familiar in Quebec now. There's a lot of debate about we have those contracts for that electricity in hand, but I think there's no longer a thought of a surplus of hydroelectricity coming out of Quebec. So that option of getting more hydroelectricity in the future from Quebec seems kind of limited. So offshore wind is even more important. And like I said, that is going to put more pressure on people to support nuclear, since we can't really rely as heavily on additional loads of hydro. Especially since, this power line took a lot of work to get through. There was another power line that National Grid was trying to build called Twin States, and they just abandoned that. So I think in part because they were looking ahead to the fact that, Quebec is not looking to sell. Hydro-Quebec's not looking to export the way they once were. So, it's always this kind of steady balance, and ISO New England has been able to keep the lights on. We're lucky we have not had really long cold snap, because at that point, obviously, the natural gas that would go to power plants would go to heating homes and businesses, And if that happens, if all that natural gas, if none of it makes it to the power plants can use some of the natural gas plants have, oil backup generators, but they will eventually run out of that oil. And so they have stockpiles for, I believe, a few days, maybe it's longer. But a long cold snap, we could be really at risk of having rolling blackouts. And so there's a real pressure to bring in, to get more renewable energy and to figure out how we supplant the older power plants that'll be closing down. And there's no easy solution. I do think that the fact that the states are cooperating more than they ever have before is really important. And it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. I know you may have, I think there were some questions in the chat. I haven't had a chance to look at them. I'm just going to leave it up, because I've been rambling a bit. I'm going to wrap it up now. And I don't know if Ron, you want to ask some questions or
yeah, I think you've given us a good start, and I'm sure there'll be questions. Let me just begin though. I mean, I'm very interested in your take on Eversource decision related to offshore wind. I mean, they've recently bailed out of their plans to develop offshore wind. How does that compute in terms of and I share your view on the dependence we have on offshore wind, but when the major supplier in New England bails out, what is the implication from your perspective?
Well, I'll sort of explain it here. So Eversource, so it's very interesting. I started out by saying the utilities, they're now Eversource and National Grid primarily. There are a few others, but they were more back then. And those of us in Boston wouldn't remember Boston Edison or Commonwealth Electric or Cambridge Electric. So that the idea was that they would not get back into, they weren't legally prevented from getting into generation, but they were sort of encouraged to shy away from it. And Eversource, early on, when the states in New England were moving toward these long-term contracts, Eversource thought that this would be a way to kind of increase growth, especially after their own power line project, which was called Northern Pass, didn't succeed in New Hampshire. They were looking for a new way to kind of, they're publicly traded, and they needed to, they wanted to get a little bit beyond the steady Eddie returns of an electric utility, and getting in at the ground floor. They did not pay a lot of money to get in the ground floor with the company's now Ørsted, the Danish energy company, to develop off the coast of New England offshore wind farms. But what happened was, in that period that I was describing, offshore wind in the United States in 2022 and 2023 became a big liability because the costs were so high to develop, and all the contracts that everyone was counting on had to be ripped up. And so the CEO who's there now, Joe Nolan, was not the CEO who decided to go into offshore wind. He's looking at the stock price of Eversource, which has really struggled a bit, and realizes this offshore wind bet is not really played out right. So he starts trying to sell the business. Eventually, he sold it. Some of it they sold to their partner, and some of it they sold to an infrastructure fund. But it took a long time to do, and I'm sure they sold it for a lot less than they wanted to, and they wrote off. But it essentially lost $2 billion on this. So Eversource is approaching offshore wind from two different ways. They're contracting for offshore wind as the utility, but they also have their unregulated arm trying to develop offshore wind. They really have no choice on the contracting. That's the state legislature's decision to sort of essentially impose this upon the utilities as a matter of policy to encourage offshore wind development. But they did have a choice on the unregulated development side, and they were just realized they were burning up too much money and wanted to get out. We saw they were not the only company that did this at that time. There were several that did, and I mean, if you're one who believes in the future of offshore wind, you're going to be disappointed by seeing companies withdraw from the market. But you can also look at it from, I mean, if you're the CEO of a public company and your stock is dropping into the toilet. I mean, I read every year at the end of the year, I look at all of the New England stocks of the major companies and see who did the best and who did the worst. And Eversource did, if it wasn't the worst in New England, it was one of the top 2 or 3 last year. I mean, Moderna struggled a bit, but I say struggled just because in the previous year, they had done so well. They were almost overvalued because of their work in the COVID vaccine world. And so I think it's less of a story that they had fallen back versus Eversource, which was really in the tank. I mean, they were down, their stock was down 25% last year. And that's at a time when utilities in general were struggling because of these issues and others. But the utility stocks as a whole were down 12, 13%. So I see why the CEO would get out of it. And I think having less investment in offshore wind, it does make it harder for the industry to develop. Obviously, Eversource is not completely leaving offshore wind in a way because it is going to be at the table as buying electricity as mandated by the state. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's kind of what I thought. But the corollary question is, who do you think is the major offshore wind developer in New England today?
Right now, it's Avangrid, who I would say may very well be known soon by its Spanish parent company Iberdrola, because they are buying out. It's a publicly traded company, but their parent company is buying out all that stock and taking it private.
Yeah,
they're definitely large here. Ørsted is really the Danish company that had gone into business with Eversource. They're another big player. And there's a joint venture there was news about this week. Another Shell got out of offshore wind in New England by selling its stake in what's called South Coast Wind to a joint venture called Ocean Winds North America, which is again two European companies, Engie and EDP Renewables. So Ocean Winds North America is the other big player, and we will probably see bids from Ocean Winds North America, Ørsted, Ocean Winds North America, and Avangrid, aka Iberdrola, next week. The company that was originally called Statoil, now Equinor, they control a lease area as well, but it is the furthest one from Massachusetts mainland, and they have not been. It seems like they've not been eager to bid into the markets here in Massachusetts. They have pursued, with I think a different lease area, they have pursued work in New York, but I think that's the gamut of players right now.
Very good, very good. Let's take a couple of hands. Albert, you're first.
Yeah. Hi, John.
Hi.
How intermittent is the expected output of these offshore wind projects? And is there any plan to build large storage to make up for any intermittency?
Well, so I get a lot of flack from when I write from the offshore wind haters when I write like how many homes are going to be supported by offshore wind, and I use the numbers that the companies give because it's all real guesstimate. But Vineyard Wind supposedly will generate 800. I mean, it's got 800 megawatt capacity. That's supposedly enough electricity for 400,000 homes. That 400,000 homes is based on the fact that offshore wind is that those windmills will be running at about 50% of what a onshore like nuclear or gas plant would be running. So I think that generally speaking, the thought is offshore wind would be 40 to 60% running. That's the thought of the hope. Obviously we have Europe to look at as models, but we don't really have much to look at quite yet here in the U.S. And then they're trying to figure out how to pair storage. It'll be interesting to see what kind of storage proposals are included in this round. They really weren't part of the last round, but there's been a lot of talk lately about storage. You're also hearing some talk about green hydrogen, which is sort of similar to storage in that you're basically creating hydrogen. You're taking that energy from offshore wind and creating hydrogen that you can store as a gas. We'll see. I don't. That's got its own controversies. Finding partly right now is there's a race for. There's a big competition among various startups to come up with the next big grid scale storage battery, because right now what's out there now is not. I mean, we're seeing it in pilot projects. There's one out in Provincetown that seems to be working pretty well. I believe there's one on Block Island, but it's not been readily or widely adopted. So we're sort of hopefully on the precipice of a new generation of batteries that will be easier to and less expensive to deploy. Meanwhile, hopefully we'll see some state policy efforts that would include storage among long-term contracts. The RFP, if my memory is correctly, for the bids that open next week do include some language of storage, but I don't think it's mandatory. And we'll have to see what happens when those bids get opened.
So these windmills could start operating before the storage is resolved. Is that correct? And that's what's happening.
It really depends. Like I said, we have wind farm. We have one wind farm that is operating now that is really not. It's really feeding into the New York grid, not the New England grid. And we have another that is coming soon, and maybe it's starting to bring electricity into the grid, but it's probably about a year away before Vineyard Way is completely done, and so those don't have batteries tied to them. The next that period of time that I talked about there's a huge gap in time between when the next wind farms will be built, because all those old projects got suspended. And so what I don't know is, will the next round include battery storage? And if so, I'm sure it'll be part of the development of those wind farms. We'll find out more next week, presumably, but it's not mandatory that they include that in their bids.
Thank you.
Sure. Ron, do you recommend if I check through the chats for some questions? I think some of them might be comments. I haven't had a chance to look. Or does anybody else? I'm not a master at Zoom. Is anybody else raising their hand with a question?
Walter is.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, John. I've got a few questions. Let's see. What happens when Mystic closes? I think it's July 1st, and I think it's 1,200 megawatts goes off the system. And related to that, where's the LNG coming from now? Of course, we used to get it from Russia and from Yemen. And I understand we can't bring the Louisiana LNG up because of the Jones Act. Does it go all the way to Europe and then back over to us? And how does that work? And then another question, unrelated, is It seems as though Bitcoin mining is really dragging down the grid. There's some Bitcoin mining in Connecticut, but a big operation up in New York, and a lot of these new Bitcoin mining operations are owned by the Chinese, where they can't operate in China anymore. They're moving their operations here in the U.S. So I know those are unrelated questions, but if you could give
All
a
right,
try.
let me try to address them. We've got Mystic going offline, LNG, and Bitcoin mining. So Mystic going offline, Mystic officially no longer is part of what's called the capacity market at the end of May, and so it will shut down, it'll power out. And that'll be it. Those are the last two units will no longer be with us, and that's a huge amount of electricity. I want to say it's probably around 1,600 megawatts, and it's a huge amount of electricity right in the heart of the demand center for New England, i.e., Greater Boston. You know, 4 or 5 years ago, there were really big concerns about Mystic going offline, and they did get a 2-year extension that was controversial, that FERC approved, that was obviously pushed, you know, the cost of which was sort of spread out over the rate base. But FERC approved it, basically saying, you know, Exelon/Constellation, you are not going to get another one. So what happened in the meantime? ISO New England put out a bid for transmission development. It's not necessarily bringing new megawatts into New England, but what it is because of the constraints in Greater Boston, it addressed the constraints in Greater Boston, in which Boston was very reliant on that power plant for reliability. And now there are new, you don't really see it as much because they're underground or they're on existing right of ways, but there are new transmission improvements that have made Mystic less important to reliability in Boston. So we're losing those megawatts from the New England grid. There's not as much concern as there once was, because the bigger issue was reliability in Boston, not necessarily reliability for all of New England. And that reliability in Boston is now supposedly addressed. We'll see. But ISO New England knows a lot more about it than I do. And I think I've not heard them sounding alarms the way they used to. The part of now LNG is sort of related, because when a lot of the LNG came from, blanking on the African country, but there was an African country where we once got a lot of our LNG from, and there would be political tumult, and the LNG shipments would stop, and ISO would put out a warning saying Mystic might not get enough LNG to run, and Boston should be prepared. And I was one of the few people who actually paid attention to those warnings. I would write about them, but I don't know, you know, what are you going to do? Fortunately, we're not. Most of our LNG comes from Trinidad and Tobago today. You know, it is a merchant system in that, you know, we could get a shipment from another location. Obviously, we're not getting Russian gas, although there was, I believe it was called the Gasolis. It was a large LNG ship that showed up here that had some Russian molecules, for lack of a better phrase, in it, and that created some controversy after the invasion. We have accepted some Russian gas, but it's pretty minimal. I can't remember where they got mixed in with another shipment in Europe, I believe. But you know, every once in a while I'll look at. We don't have a lot of shipments in on LNG because it hasn't been that cold here in New England in the last 2 years. But when I do see them, it's usually Trinidad and Tobago. There are probably some other places that I'm not thinking of where that shipments might be coming from. I just can't say offhand. Bitcoin mining is a little bit out of my bailiwick, in part because electricity is so expensive here in New England that it would be hard to really do a profitable Bitcoin mining operation. We don't see a lot of server farms, that sort of thing here, because of the electricity costs are so high. There are areas particularly municipal electric departments where electricity is a lot more affordable. Holyoke, for example, runs the majority on hydroelectricity. So it's a very interesting pocket of Massachusetts where the electricity is a lot cheaper than the rest of the state. I don't think we've really seen much of that development there. We have, we do see computing centers happen in Holyoke, but I haven't really come across much Bitcoin development. I'm not familiar with what's happening in Connecticut, and I don't really follow what's happening in New York. We do get imports and we do export to New York, so it's not that we're unconnected. But I often think of the grid as sort of like the island of Manhattan, with there are some bridges and tunnels in and out, but we're mostly sort of on the island right now, and so I just don't follow as much what happens in PJM and other parts of the grid outside of New England.
Good. John, just a follow-up question. Do you know if the state or ISO is looking at tapping distributed battery storage? Like at my house, I have a Tesla Powerwall, and there's a lot. And as you probably know, Green Mountain Power in Vermont, has a whole program for that. So, is the state
I'm
looking
surprised
at that?
that Green Mountain. That was I actually wrote about it when they announced that, and I thought, oh, that's a great idea. I'm surprised we haven't seen more of that. I feel like that's sort of falls under the solar incentive bucket, in that mostly if you're getting solar on your rooftop, you might try to get one of those Tesla batteries as well. And so maybe there's some benefit, and I don't know for sure, like to whatever solar incentive you're getting if you're having that battery. I'm not quite sure why the state has not pushed that more. I can't answer like why we haven't done a program like Vermont did. I don't know.
In fact, John, I did sign up for the program with Eversource. I've had my battery for 2 years now. They've never tapped it. And so I'm not sure that the whole plan is being used. And it just seems to be.
When you say you signed up for the program with Eversource, which program is that?
Let's see. I forget the name of it. Connected
Is
Services.
it like a pilot program where they're encouraging distributed battery use?
It's for emergency. So when the grid is at its peak and they need cheaper power, they can draw off my battery. But they've never had to do that.
Would you also get demand response payments from that? If they need that electricity, if they ask you to turn it off, would you get paid?
Okay. I would get paid if they extracted power from my battery.
But what if they asked you to turn off the cut power to your house? Would you and go to the battery to use the battery? Would you get paid for that?
Yeah, they don't have that program now.
Okay.
But I could do that. I could take it off the grid anytime.
Have you
I think that.
Have you had a need to use it? Have you had an incident where you needed to use that battery?
No. Well, yeah, actually, there's a couple of power outages, short ones. And I can take it off the grid anytime.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Did they pay you? Even if they don't ever draw from it, or do they pay you an annual payment for having that available to them?
They're supposed to, if only if they draw from it. So they've never drawn from it for 2 years. So I'm not sure why it's not being implemented, because I've seen looking at the ISO cost per kilowatt hour is extremely high.
Yeah. Let's see, we got a number of other hands up, so maybe we could move. Well, go ahead. Sure. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, that's good.
Let's go to Bill Swan.
Hi, John. I like your reporting. So good stuff.
Thanks for saying.
There's an issue that pops up every once in a while in the articles about ISO New England and the way it allows renewables to both bid and be dispatched. And they're having some rules where it's making it harder for them, and they keep putting off relaxing those rules. Is that anything you can speak to? I don't know the whole issue.
Oh yeah, no, I know what you're referring to, and I haven't. It's that there was a big kerfuffle about this last year. I honestly can't speak to how it was resolved. I mean, essentially, ISO is in that tug of war that I was describing of sort of, the renewables and their supporters want more support to move us quicker off of natural gas, while the natural gas industry wants more support to keep it going, saying you're not ready to move off natural gas. And so ISO, because if it's going to default to something, it's going to default to what is going to ensure the best reliability. It cares about cost, it cares about climate, but its number one reason for existing is reliability. So it's going to default to that. I did not really get too involved in following that. I think just because I have to sort of pick my battles and what I cover, and my editors they're interested in the big projects that get built, but the sort of the back and forth between the environmentalists who are sort of pushing for better treatment at ISO and ISO. I kind of followed in the trade press and talked to people about, but I didn't really cover it that much. So I can't really speak to any level of expertise.
Okay, well, thanks a lot.
Sure.
John, I know your time is limited this morning, but we have 3 more hands up. Do you have a few more minutes, or?
Yeah, I can stay for a few more minutes. I'm unfortunately running behind on something I got to get to my editor.
No, I understand.
Well, let's get to the questions. Let's get to the questions that we got.
Let's go to Pete.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pete Baldwin here. I have two questions. When we implemented the renewable portfolio standard, I think we made a mistake because all of the renewables create this duck curve, or now it's becoming a canyon curve. And it would be a good idea to include balancing storage in any renewable offerings going forward. Just an opinion. Second is the issue of I put a question on the chat about the price of carbon. We now have a price on methane. It seems to be accepted as a concept. We should use the same approach on CO2. I've advocated for quite a long time now that we should have a waste disposal fee for CO2. And the money should be applied to activities to prevent CO2, whether it's carbon capture, mass transit, or otherwise. Opinions.
I think I can speak to the idea of carbon pricing, in that there has been general support for that, but when it gets to the point of getting it through the legislature, the fear is that it'll be portrayed as yet another tax. Is sort of like the equivalent of a gas tax.
That's why a waste disposal fee is a better approach, like methane.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll have to talk to the House and Senate chairs of the Energy Committee are working right now on various bills that'll make up the climate bill that you will see. And I don't think that's in there, but I'll have to chat with them about that. I have heard them talk about that in the past, but what you're suggesting by waste disposal fee, you're saying this would
create CO2, you got to pay to recover.
Yeah. Right. And that would be for any power plant, or how
whoever creates the CO2.
So would you impose it upon, if I'm driving my Honda, I would have some sort of fee that I would pay?
Would it be embedded in a gasoline price?
Yeah. 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 And how would that be different to the consumer than a carbon tax.
See a price on gasoline that would include the fee, and
Yeah.
the guy that made the gasoline would have to provide the fee or the power, etc. We do it at Jiffy Lube. When you go to Jiffy
Yeah.
Lube and change
Right.
your oil, there's a
Yeah.
disposal fee.
Right. No, it's a good idea. I'll next time I talk to one of them, I'll mention it and see what they think. I haven't given it a lot of thought. Like I said, I followed sort of the carbon tax debate, and it hasn't really gone far in New England for just because it gets lumped in as a fuel tax.
Why this is so important is every time we talk about renewables or whatever, we talk about it's too expensive, and then nobody says
Right.
compared to what.
Yeah.
And compared to what needs to have the price of carbon embedded.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I won't argue with you there. It's a great point.
Let's take another question. Avi, you're up.
Question I have is you have to write about these matters, and the audience that's reading the column spans a wide range of interest and talent. And I'm curious as to how you strike a balance when you're crafting a column or delving into an issue. How do you strike the balance between being too technical and not technical enough? Do you just follow your own guidance system, or do you have somebody you talk to? Does the editor step in? Do you have any kind of metric that you go to determine how the article should read?
That's a great question, and it's something that I'm confronted with almost all times I write about energy. Usually, my whoever's editing the story, if they come across sort of industry terms that the average person wouldn't recognize, that immediately gets stripped out. And even if, as I often try to do, I don't just introduce a term that most people aren't familiar without explaining it. So I try to include a definition. The editors just hate seeing that stuff, and I get where they're coming from. So it's very hard sometimes. I will make the argument that, for the people who know these things, and if I'm going to really sort of break it down in layperson's terms, and it could be and it could be confused with something else that's similar, I will make an argument that we should use the phrase. I can't think of any examples offhand, but we should use the phrase to make sure that people who do understand it know I'm talking about X and not Y. But I really do try to simplify everything to the greatest extent that, that someone in high school should be able to pick up the story and read it and understand what's going on. And that seems like it should be easy, but I'm sure for a lot of people here that you can recognize that when you're writing about energy issues, it can be a challenge. So almost every story I write about energy has some sort of terminology that it would be off-putting to readers and or my editors. And it's a struggle to keep that terminology in. I have to really justify it, and I have to really explain it and smooth it out. But most times I really have to speak in as plain terms as possible.
I know there's when you do public speaking, there's sort of a rule of thumb that think of your audience as intelligent 10th graders.
Yeah.
They're bright, but they don't know much.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
You have to assume that people who are reading are bright, but are not well versed in the arcana of the world that you're well versed in.
All right.
Thanks.
Tom, you have the last word today. You're up. You're muted. Tom, you're muted. Yeah.
I've seen a recent YouTube segment in which the CEO of Toyota says that they are not developing a wide range of electric vehicles. They are developing hydrogen instead because they see a giant problem down the road 10, 20 years that our grid has no way of distributing the needed electricity for all these electric vehicles. It will require tens of thousands of billions, trillions to get the grid in place for this. Do you see that also as a problem?
I do. I don't know. I don't know if, I mean, I'm going to trust that this person, who's living is making these decisions for a major car manufacturer knows it better than me. But our big issue right now is what is commonly known as range anxiety. It's more of an issue of there aren't even places to charge these cars. And so there are concerns about being able to go far. I think hydrogen would have those same concerns because there are very few refueling stations for that right now, and it would take a long time to build that infrastructure. We're finding it hard to even build what I would think is simpler infrastructure than hydrogen refueling, which is electricity charging. So I don't think we're going to go by the way. I think electric cars are in the future. I think the issue that the utilities are grappling with is so there's the charging, the locations of the chargers and how few there are right now, and getting them to work, and how do you pay for that for them, the upkeep of those chargers. But then there's the question of the distributed nature of this electricity usage. It's no longer just going to be drawn down at homes and businesses, but all over I guess the business would be the gas station, for lack of a better phrase, but it just means you're taking a bigger draw on different parts of the grid. The utilities are working on that. I can't speak to other parts of the country, but I know Eversource and National Grid have been prodded to do grid modernization plans that reflect this dilemma. So I think right now the EV market is struggling not only with the prices, but also the concerns about, because it's expensive to buy an electric car still, but the concerns about being able to get charging when you need it. And that is the bigger short-term challenge. I think in the long term, our utilities have got to figure out a way to address the flow of electricity. And there's all sorts of startups that are looking at various ways to maximize the flow of electricity. There's a lot of, I guess if you'd say, is excess capacity at certain times of day, and how, just like there are roads, they're sort of like the old power lines, they're not empty, but there are ways to make them more efficient. And so we have startups that are looking at how to do that in the best way possible to help accommodate the way the grid is changing. Not only is it the drawdown of electricity changing and increasing, but the fact of the matter is that the generation is becoming much more distributed because of all the solar, behind the meter solar that we have in New England. And the fact that it's not, you don't just have like a dozen power plants that are powering New England. Those power plants are much more disparate, and that requires a whole rejiggered grid. And so the utilities know this and they're working on it, and the regulators know this and they're working on it. And it's sort of a little bit above my expertise to know like how far behind we are. But I think that issue is more of a long-term issue right now for EVs. The shorter-term issue is just being able to find places to charge.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. John, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for joining the group.
Sure. I hope it was helpful. Like I said,
you've given us
kind
a
of
great perspective
all
on
these distinguished
things that are of
brainiacs in
importance
the
to
room.
us, and things that are important to the Commonwealth and to the nation. So I know we all appreciate your time and effort. Thank you.
Thanks. And I hope you guys can check out the Globe for business coverage and for other coverage, because we're trying to stay on top of what's happening. So we don't always do a great job, but we always try to do a great job. And I'm a little biased, but I can't think of another news outlet in New England that's covering New England as in depth as we are. So keep us in mind, and I hope we can stay in touch, and maybe I can come back and visit again in the future.
You'd always be welcome, John, honest.
Great.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Sure, of course. Thanks a
Okay.
lot. Have a great day, a great
Yeah.
weekend, everyone. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for joining
See you
us. Take care.
soon.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good. Ron, you gonna stay with us? Yes.
Oh,
Okay.
oh, that's right. Ron, I don't know who has the host.
So
I mean, it looks like Ron stepped out, but
Ron's
we're
the
still
host.
on.
Ron is gone.
But
And
we're
then-
still here.
Oh,
We're still here.
suddenly I'm the host. I guess I don't know how
Oh,
I
maybe he
became.
gave that to you. Okay, well, good. Then the rest of us who are hanging on, if anyone wants to make any comment or anything.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Walter for bringing up a number of the things I had in the chat. I cannot imagine why it is that utilities and correspondents seem to always ignore on-building solar and storage and electric vehicles and the capability they have. It's particularly ironic that right at the moment, ISO New England's demand curve is showing down to only 8 gigawatts instead of the usual 15 because of behind meter solar. Why can't they face reality? This change is going to happen, and it's going to happen fast, and they need to get out in front of it and start doing more GMP-like programs across New England. It's very frustrating sitting here in Florida seeing that. Your prices are up at 30 cents. They're 10 cents down here in Florida. Something's got to give.
Yeah, first of all, what does GMP mean?
Green Mountain Power.
Oh, yeah, in
That
Vermont.
program is wonderful. I'm sitting with a friend from Vermont who is down here in Florida enjoying what should be sunshine, but is instead rain today, and watching his house basically be there, ready to supply the rest of the customers with his storage from Tesla's battery on command from GMP. And he's paid slightly to participate in that program, and GMP has contributed. And the result is that all of GMP's ratepayers save because of the customers who are participating in the solar on buildings with storage program that they have. I can't wait until it gets into EV. In fact, GMP has a program to help its customers buy electric vehicles. So get on board with the rest of the utilities.
So, since you have a friend there who actually is a customer or whatever, Green Mountain Power, do they have a time of day variable rate for electricity and it bidirectionally, you know, whether it's, you know, coming from the grid or being fed into the grid?
I'll let him answer, but essentially, no. He's made the basic agreement that they can use up to 80% of his battery storage anytime they feel
can use 100%.
Okay.
They can use 100%. The thing is, GMP's running a pilot on plugging cars in. So, I mean, my Tesla Powerwall is 14 or 13 kW, and my car is kh, and my car is 77 kWh. So there's plenty of capacity if we could start to use cars. You know, it's you know, there's plenty of options, and there's conservation.
Right.
So what do you pay for electricity at GMP? How much per kilowatt hour do you pay, both for energy and distribution?
It doesn't. I have solar in my house, so I bought my 10 years ago.
Yeah,
but
so
the
you don't see
current
it.
rate at GMP
it's about 20 cents. It's about 20 cents residential.
And in New Hampshire, because of my solar always producing more than I use, I never see a bill that lists per kilowatt hour price. I'm told from my neighbors that it's in the 30-cent range now.
Right. And Mike, you're in Holyoke. You're at 16 cents a kilowatt hour, right? Which is amazing. That includes distribution. So
we're at 11.
Wow.
It's a municipal power, so they're a nonprofit,
And even at that, they're returning about 800,000 a year to the city itself too.
But of course, you got a lot of hydro there. But look out for the Bitcoin miners. Look out for the Chinese, quite literally. They'll want to source a Bitcoin mining operation there.
Well, I've thought about doing that on my excess solar, but it never seems to pan out at the low scale that I'd be doing it at.
Right.
So, what we don't have, you're talking about, we're paying 30 cents a kilowatt hour around, here, Boston. That's combined, I think, between the generation.
Right.
But it's except that they change it every 6 months. It's fixed and it's terrible because it doesn't encourage people to store electricity. It doesn't encourage people to provide electricity at the right time. That, if we had a time of use rate, and when there's plenty of power, make it 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Everyone could use as much as you want, because we got to, we have more.
That's the case now in the middle of the day.
Right. Exactly.
The utility is not taking and transmitting those savings to the customer. They're still charging.
And then if
we need an aggregator.
And then if you had a rate of like 40 cents a kilowatt hour when, generation is approaching its max or whatever, for one thing,
so this would encourage people as high as $1.50, by the way. So that it is there within their scheme. They're just not taking advantage of the opportunity to utilize solar and storage on buildings and cars. And we need an aggregator to propose that and bid it into the New England grid.
Right. I think it requires legislation. So I think you need to, in other words, there's a
lot
of constraints because of legislation.
Storage.
No, Peter, that's the whole point. We have storage. We want to give it away. In fact, in Texas, there's a pilot program with Tesla, and they are a provider of electricity now for the grid. And if you join that program, you can supply energy to the grid at a certain price. So the time of use pricing. So people in Texas that have a Tesla solar panels and Tesla Powerwall, they can join that program where there's a peak. I don't know what the peak is in Texas, whether it's probably around 4 or 5 o'clock. They can feed electricity back into the grid from the batteries and make money. They can be making money. Individuals can be making money if they sign up for this program.
Who has dispatch authority?
Yes, they do.
Who has dispatch authority?
The ERCOT, which is Texas.
That's the issue. Who has the dispatch authority?
Right. Yeah. And so it can be done. But it needs legislation and initiative.
It's a distributed energy resource program, and the dispatch authority is always, I want to control my power, or the electricity company is. But you give up your dispatch authority and you get the money.
Right. We'd just like to be able to do that. And New England utilities don't, with the exception of Green Mountain Power to some extent.
So, okay. So that's interesting, because Vermont is part of ISO New England region, and they are, and they're able to initiate the program that Green Mountain Power has. So, although it's true, then there's, Massachusetts has laws, which can be different from Vermont's laws. But I don't know. I think to some extent, there are certain constraints that you say, well, the Massachusetts law doesn't allow this kind of pricing or whatever. If you would have to change the Massachusetts law in order to make that possible. But I don't know the details, but hopefully Mike Barrett's on that. I mean, I know they're working on another big climate-y type omnibus bill for this session.
Well, good. Any other comments?
Yeah, I thought I was gonna have to put a 1,500-mile extension cord to Florida, but now I only need a 20-mile extension cord to Holyoke.
Very good. Why I've never understood why I can't transport my Florida excess kilowatt hours to New Hampshire, where they are more valuable and useful. It seems to me that we ought to get them to allow customers to cross bill across all the utilities so that we can take advantage of our production.
I guess if you have a Ford F-150 and you go down to Florida and you charge it up, then you can drive it back to New Hampshire and plug it in and unload it.
Use Georgia, then you'd have to use Maryland, and then you'd have to use New Jersey, and but the idea of porting that fuel or the electricity across multiple utility zones is what I'm after. There's no reason we can't do that. We managed to do it with other things.
Well, I mean, it would take, I think, some DC power lines, right?
That's right.
No, DC is bad for transmission.
Don't I know?
My understanding is that that's when they're trying to, take from excess wind in the Great Plains region to bring it, toward in the direction of the coast.
It's simpler to move all those New York people out to North Dakota and make the demand move to where the resource is than it is to move the resource to where the demand happens to be.
That's why hybrid vehicles are more popular than battery vehicles, because you can get by. You don't have to worry.
You get to pay to carry all that crap around and maintain it. It's ridiculous. Hybrid vehicles are a dumb in-between thing. Even Toyota makes an all-electric vehicle in the worst possible name, BZ4X, or Busy Forks, as we like to call it. Look it up. They do it. They sell it.
Rose right off the lips. Hey, talk about DC power.
We have a Prius Prime. That sounds better, but that's the one that's the plug-in hybrid one. So
then there's the Prius Double Prime.
I have a plug-in hybrid, and it lives on gasoline.
Because the electricity costs too much here.
Yes.
See now that would be if we had time of day rates here, then you could charge your Volt in the middle of the night when the rates are low.
No, in the middle of the daytime when it will help use up all that behind the meter solar.
Yeah, right. Anyway, you would be able to charge it at the right time of day, and then it would be cheaper than gasoline. But since they just have the fixed price all day long, it's better. It's cheaper to use gasoline.
There's a misconception that a hybrid vehicle costs less to run than an EV. An EV, my cost per mile is about 10 cents per mile, whereas the cost per mile for a hybrid vehicle of similar size, not a Prius Prime, but similar size, is probably going to be around 12 or 13 cents per mile. So
here in Florida, it's 5 cents a mile, and because my excess solar is worth only 2 cents to the utility every year, it's negative cents per mile. I try to use EV here.
So EVs are cost per mile are cost less than a hybrid or any other vehicle. So not only that, an EV is using electricity that's generated here in New England, at least, only a half of it by fossil fuels. So you reduce your carbon footprint with an EV by about 50 to 75%.
So the idea is plug in that damn Volt.
That's right.
The other thing is that the Volt is much quieter on electric than it is on gas, and you can drive that 40 miles on all electric if you're careful. And you don't go
true, Bob? Is it quieter?
Yes, it's much quieter because the gas engine ain't running. And it doesn't annoy the neighbors as much, except when it comes on with its hissy noise below 15 miles an hour.
One of the things I'm interested in trying, when we run a ton of wood through this system out here, we get 70,000 cubic feet of biogas. It's pretty clean gas, mostly hydrogen, methane, some CO2, some CO. But I'm interested in compressing the gas and running it in a vehicle, very much like propane vehicles.
CNG.
It's something that's not happening yet, but ultimately, for the 70,000 cubic feet of gas, we've sequestered 1 ton of CO2 from the atmosphere. So essentially, you're almost driving on biogas with a carbon negative impact on the environment. I think it's better than electric, but I'm not sure yet, but I'm
There are
going to try it.
CNG vehicles around. You try one on a CNG vehicle.
Well, again, it's the same thing, Peter. Yes, we're going to provide, instead of CNG, a biogas.
Right.
And I think it condenses into a liquid at 135 psi. But we're going to find that out too.
CNG didn't make much of a headway except in fleet vehicles, so that would be a natural application.
What I have trouble with all these conversions between the various fuel carriers like biogas and the rest is how anything can possibly beat the sheer usefulness of it being in electrical form. And sure, you can run a CNG vehicle, but you've got all those problems with it, and you don't have the capability of using it for other things at the same time. It's so wonderful to be able to move electricity in and out of those batteries and out from the solar and put it into the buildings or whatever the hell you're going to use. It's just, I can't see the reason to convert electricity into another carrier of fuel. It's just
I don't think Michael is starting with electricity.
He's starting, well, another thing is I don't understand with Michael how it is that you take something that's already sequestered the CO2, namely wood chips, and then turn it into somehow that's
the wood chips.
CO2?
If Michael doesn't process the wood chips, they turn into methane.
But this is hundreds of years. This is not tomorrow, and that's always an argument with anything that has to do with calling a wood chip a renewable source, because ultimately, no, it's not. But we put the wood chips compressed into things called buildings, and they're out there for hundreds of years.
Well, the wood chips that Michael is using were not destined to be at buildings.
Correct, so. But you can always upsource them somewhat. It's we can't, we're burning wood chips into electricity in New England. They don't even want to do that because they claim it's more expensive than 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And it's not. And they never take into account the local benefits involved with that. But that's all kind of on the side compared to the clear, just plain cleanliness involved with solar.
Well, again, cleanliness at the solar panel, but you start looking at some of these mining sites and these 8-year-old children that are working 12 hours a day in indentured slaves, and you look at the half million
so the
pounds of dirt you have to move before you get to the lithium. My system's completely recyclable at the end of its life.
Yeah, but the solar side has always been getting better rather than worse with regard to that. And they're always such a minor impact of it. It's similar to when they say, oh, well, it uses so much energy to make the panels that they never pay back in energy. That's bull, and has been bull for years. It's down to a year now and less. We've got to start thinking about what we can do to increase rapidly this kind of stuff instead of charging an extra $200 on an electric vehicle registration in New Hampshire. Hence, the New Hampshire car has moved to Florida where they don't do that yet.
Anyway, I have to go. You guys can, stay.
No, I think it's time. Thank you.
It's time.
Thank you, everyone. That was a great talk and energized a lot of discussion. See you next 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, everybody.